Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome Kim Penberthy, who is going to be talking about her experience as the professor of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. It's actually the Chester F. Carlson's Professor of Psychiatry, and she's going to expand a little bit more on what this means, because this is really interesting. So Kim is a clinical psychologist. She is also a teacher and a researcher. She is a founding member of the UVA Contemplative Sciences Center and is co-director of the Effective Communication and Coping Skills for Physicians, and also a founding member of BWise, which is dedicated to promoting mindfulness, wisdom, and compassion in medicine. She is a meditator, and her interest is in bringing those two things together. Her interest in meditation and consciousness, contemplative practices, and the intentional alteration of consciousness, as well as their potential positive impact on human potential and healing. So this evening, Kim is going to be talking about the Division of Perceptual Studies of the University in Virginia, where she works, its history and current research focus, including near-death experience and their impact. And then she will focus on her current research, exploring the impact of both spontaneous experiences, such as perceived communications from deceased loved ones, and intentionally induced alterations in consciousness via things like meditation and other contemplative exercises. So it is my great pleasure to pass the word over to Kim. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored and humbled to be here this evening where you are. It's late afternoon here. I have so much respect for all of you and what you do, and I'm very excited to share my perspective on something that I'm assuming everyone on this Zoom meeting finds very interesting and important. So I hope to also gain from your vast amount of knowledge as well. So thank you. And what I will do is start by sharing the infamous PowerPoint that has become ubiquitous to these sorts of events. So yes, what I'm going to be talking about is an introduction to the work we do at the Division of Perceptual Studies, which is a division within the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, which is in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it's a very unique sort of division because we are really dedicated. You typically would not think of maybe being in a department of psychiatry or in the School of Medicine. So just to start off a little bit about who I am and the chair that I have, as Claudia mentioned. I am a clinical psychologist and have been able to be appointed to the Chester F. Carlson Chair, which comes along with being appointed in DOPS, the Division of Perceptual Studies, my division. So this chair was endowed by Chester Carlson, who invented the Xerox machine. And his interests were in the paranormal realm of the things like previous lives and recurrence of memories of these, so reincarnation type of ideas, And so when he passed and left his estate, he endowed this chair so that people like myself could participate in doing research on these sort of unusual topics without the stress of trying to find additional funding. So that has been a great benefit to us at my division. So what I'm going to be talking about is the work we do there historically and currently. The division itself, so we'll be going through sort of these topics here. And the division itself fits in line quite well with my interest coming into this field. So I am a clinical psychologist. I was meditating before I went into psychology and had a lot of influence by early readings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. My mother taught me transcendental meditation when I was quite young, and I've practiced that a good deal as well as other kinds of meditation. Raymond Moody was also at our Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, and I remember reading his books early on and being greatly influenced by that. And of course, my father and mother were in the medical field, my father a surgeon and my mother an ICU nurse, and they would often share some unusual experiences that they witnessed in their work with people presenting, sort of unusual stories. This all influenced me. And when I got my formal training, probably like many of you, I continued to learn, and this was more mainstream learning, things like dialectical behavior therapy for people with borderline personality or traits, and different therapies as they came up. Many of them the contemplative-based or mindfulness or contextual, what some call third wave therapies. And so I did a lot of deep training in these. My major professor is Jim McCullough, who developed cognitive behavioral analysis system of psychotherapy. This is one of the most effective treatments for persistent depressive disorder. And I've maintained an ongoing relationship with him. He's still alive and here in Richmond, Virginia. Anyway, so all of this really helped guide my career and my interest with a focus on both of these components of the science of psychotherapy and the science of these paranormal sort of components. And so in many ways, without even knowing it, I was quite well suited for the Division of Perceptual Studies and found a home there from the moment I landed at the University of Virginia. So a little bit about the Division of Perceptual Studies. We just call it DOPS for short. So it was founded in 1967 by the founder, Dr. Ian Stevenson. At the time, he was the chair of psychiatry in the same department I'm in. He began doing research on children who remember past lives. He called it cases of the reincarnation type. So you sometimes see his work referred to as CORT work, C-O-R-T. He got so involved in this and really wanted to dedicate his time full-time to those efforts, often traveling a great deal in India and places. So he actually resigned from the chairmanship and worked full-time in DOPS on those cases. So the division has existed since that time, with multiple people taking over different chairs. We actually have 2 endowed chairs in a very small division. So we're pretty lucky that way. It is a university-based research group, and what we dedicate our time to is the investigation of phenomena that challenge mainstream scientific paradigm. So really, especially those regarding the nature of the mind-brain relationship. We're particular consciousness functioning beyond the confines of the physical body. So that's sometimes referred as survival research, and you might have heard of that. This idea that we survive the death of this physical body, and all that that implies. So that's sort of the large, we think of it, we call it a flower pot. It's the large flower pot we're all planted in, and many of us then have different flowers that we extend up out of that ground. The primary purpose, as I said, is this investigation in the context of a scientific approach. So really an empirical investigation. And some examples of the work we do. Jim Tucker has continued the work of children who have memories of past lives, so he's doing that work. Bruce Grayson is our expert in near-death experiences, and many of those involve out-of-body experiences. We are now also exploring avenues to look at virtual out-of-body experiences. We also have research that I've been helping lead in after-death communications. And I, along with members of our lab, including Ed Kelly, if you were at the weekend presentation, you may have heard from him, look at the psychic abilities that can happen either spontaneously or we have a lab where we do neuroimaging techniques and different kinds of physiological monitoring, where we would obviously want to have the participant generate these abilities upon will, and we examine those. So we generally support the recognition of consciousness as something greater than merely a physically produced phenomena. So this is sort of our main thrust. So we also think that this is a more optimistic, materialistic worldview of this sort of all physicalness type of approach. I personally get extremely excited about the, oops, my slides have gotten away from me. In my excitement. So I get excited about the potential positive impact of this different view. So I am an extrovert, so it's very easy for me to get very excited. But I think also just the content of what we talk about is extremely interesting. So these are just some photos to show who we are. You'll see in the black, that's Ian Stevenson standing along the common, very dapper. And in the middle, and on the side of Ian Stevenson, you'll see current members. As I said, we're very small. The 5 of us there in the middle are main researchers, and the rest are folks who help support our research. And you'll see Bruce Grayson above my head, and Ed Kelly, Jim Tucker seated with me, and Marietta Pelivanova, who is in a lovely sort of turquoise dress. I'm going to start with a little bit of what we do, sort of sampling the work that's been done. It's very exciting. Some of this is research that I'm part of, and some is pretty quickly here. So as I said, Jim Tucker is the one currently investigating cases of the attribution type. He's quite well known for this in the realm of this area. So he focuses exclusively children. He's working more in North America, so really expanding beyond what Ian Stevenson did. Things generally show that people don't manifest ideas that they were Caesar or anything like that. They're often just ordinary lives that are remembered. They sometimes remember being a deceased family member, or it could be a stranger. There doesn't seem to be a significant trend there. It is often, though, however, a violent or sudden death, which is interesting. And there can also be birthmark correlations as well as physical alterations that sort of match the story of their death. And Jim is brilliant at presentations on this. He's written books, as you'll see here. And these are collections of stories with, again, this experiential study where he goes back and foundation for the statements that the children make. one interesting thing that he's noted is the statements about previous lives usually start around 2 to 5 years old and stop around 5 to 8. They're usually made with extreme intensity. I mean, the children get very emotional about it. But after they pass, they sort of stop. So he's currently looking at what happens to these people long term. And so that's research going on right now, trying to follow up with these individuals and see how these memories impacted their life. I'm very interested in the impact on their parents or their caregivers. So hopefully we will have a further study of that. And the typical he has over about 2,500 cases now worldwide, found in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, but there are cases he's finding. And there's some very interesting data because to collect so much information, you can find trends and themes in the descriptions that these children give. Sometimes they have phobias related to the mode of death. Often their likes and dislikes seem to trend. Interesting research by Marietta Pelivanova looking at cross-gender behavior in these children. Also, the children who remember a past life of a different gender than they are currently. So very interesting work with an extreme amount of data collected, and he's continuing to collect. Another area, if we can move on, is near-death experiences. So I often have people ask me, well, what is it even? What is a near-death experience? And these are experiences, as you can imagine, reported by individuals who've been close to dying or been pronounced clinically dead. This is where it gets into the nitty-gritty. Often in the cases that we study at the Division of Perceptual Studies, it's important to get the medical records and get access to these medical records in order to see what is physiologically going on. We hypothesize that it's a changed state of consciousness. So we look at it as an altered state. And we know from the research collected both at our lab and other places that an out-of-body experience seems to be a basic component of NDEs, and it's prevalent in people who report NDEs. They also report that out-of-body experience. It really began in the mid-70s with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And I should say the caveat, this began in the US, in the medical world with his book. He was in Charlottesville at the university when he wrote this. And he started with 150 cases and looked at the commonalities. As I said, Bruce Grayson has continued this research and continues to collect information from people who report this, as well as doing studies, trying to do prospective studies as well you can, as best you can, with our cardiac department, our cardiology department, where we have a ongoing agreement with them and research looking at cardiac arrest patients. We have many of their rooms set up with hidden objects that you could only see if you're floating in the room. And so when we do have someone who reports a near-death experience, we can go back and look at what they report and look at the room they were in and validate some of those that data, which is very helpful. But what you find is similar to what Raymond Moody reported early on. So this overwhelming feeling of peace and well-being. People report being free from pain. They're often reporting floating or drifting. And again, they report this out-of-body experience. They often have a light. It's culturally defined, so in your culture, if that looks like a tunnel, it's a tunnel. If it looks like a cave, it's a cave. And they often encounter or communicate with a presence and discuss this, and often see a sort of a life review, visual images of their past. And report meeting people from their life, past acquaintances, or in another world. We also look at the impact that these experiences have. And this is extremely interesting to me as a clinician. What you see is that they increase their spirituality. Typically, they report an increased interest or commitment to their spirituality or religion. They often increase their compassion, so based on self-report, obviously, and appreciation for life, their sense of meaning, purpose, and worth, and their flexibility in coping is often improved or higher. We don't really have pre-measures on these folks, so we just have to say high. And their belief in post-mortem survival obviously increases. Some attitudes that decrease, it's pretty consistent that we find if they had fear of death, that has been significantly reduced. Their interest in material possessions and personal status and competitiveness also seem to be reduced. Maybe that's in conjunction with that compassion or concern for others. But these are all things that happen sort of just spontaneously, very quickly with that near-death experience. The interesting component is that in our studies, looking at what might be the causal link that mediates or moderates that change, it looks like having an out-of-body experience is an important component. So this is that sensation of being outside of one's body, sort of floating above and separated from. So we know that you can have an out-of-body experience with a near-death experience. And it's a fundamental characteristic. You can also have them in other ways. I have interacted and spoken with people who can do this at will through meditation or through their own mechanisms of action. You can do it obviously through ingesting substances and probably many other ways I'm not even aware of. And what we've found is that these naturally occurring OBEs are, like I said, an aspect of near-death experiences and increase both the belief in life after death and decrease levels of death anxiety. So those may be related, again, based on Terra management theory in psychology. If you have less anxiety about life being the end of things, then you will have a reduced fear of death. And we're thinking that the OBE, the theory has always been that the reason it creates this reduction in fear might be because of this awareness now that consciousness exists outside the body. And that might still be the main reason. However, again, with some mathematical analysis that we're looking at, it seems to be the case only in people who have an out-of-body experience and have a very positive feeling about it. So it does not happen in people with experiences who find that very frightening or disconcerting. So this to me is very interesting because I wonder if then we could, use that. It has implications for clinical care of people with fear of death with respect to that positive affect, that positive experience that comes along with this awareness of consciousness existing outside the body. So something to think about if you're, clinicians. That was very exciting to me. And the 4 elements of NDEs we've talked about that seem to be also connected with the fear of death and reduction in that are that out-of-body experience, that disembodiment, the positive emotional content, a spiritual encounter, and that bright light seem to be also additional components that are necessary for the fear reduction. Very interesting to me. I'd love to have more discussion about that. Along the same realms of studying fear of death, we also study after-death communications. And as you can imagine, after-death communications occur when someone appears to be contacted directly and spontaneously by a deceased family member or friend. When we talk about this research, we're focused mainly on that direct, spontaneous, and so not coming through a medium or psychic or anything like that, but just sort of happening individually to the person. And usually what we see is there's a message of reassuring, resolving some conflict, or reaffirming and releasing that is very positive for the people who experience this. We were fortunate enough to be, I was a consultant on the recent international study that was funded by Salvia. I think I'm saying that name right. And this was a large international study that's just beginning to produce the results, so I'm not going to give it away too much, but very large, multinational, where it was really a call for people to report these experiences so that we can begin to describe them a little bit more. We're all familiar with this, many of us, and yet we don't really have a good literature about who experiences these, what are their effects, that sort of thing. So I will just give you a brief taste of what we discovered with a large survey. And this was that most of the people reported experience it as authentic. And they also have a decreased fear of death, increased religiousness or spirituality. They find it comforting and healing. And they increase their their belief in life after death. Many of them report that they treasure this experience. I'm happy in the question section to, talk about this a little bit more, and maybe even experiences that people have had themselves and the impact. I find this extremely interesting because of the prevalence of how many people have experienced something like this. I think we absolutely need to continue this line of research at our division and worldwide. The further exploration, as I said, we have a laboratory that is set up to do neuroimaging. We don't have a giant fMRI in there. We actually use something called FNIRS, which is like a portable fMRI, if you will. We can simultaneously collect that data with EEGs, and we typically are looking at, in these research studies, we're looking at people who have extraordinary psychic abilities. We have a current study looking at mediums who have been vetted through Winwood and different sort of organizations and have met our criteria. And it's a very elaborate, rigorous study where we're dealing with real people who have lost loved ones. And we're doing, having the mediums do readings, and we're checking the accuracy of the readings while we're collecting data on their brainwaves through EEG and FNIRS, to sort of look at what happens in these individuals when they're in this state of accessing this information. And then we'll also look at how accurate the information is. All of that's conducted in a shielded room. We have wonderful equipment where we can measure electromagnetic fields. We have a random number generator that's going all the time. So I've implemented that, for instance, in studies where we're looking at groups of people meditating and trying to influence a random number generator to make it go off random. So a lot of robust data there that we are collecting and processing. As I said, I love collaborating, so we did a wonderful collaboration with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, collecting data on meditators across the US and looking at not just the usual things you might think of when you collect data on people who meditate, like their endorsement of stress levels or pain, but we also looked at some of their psychic abilities, and we were able to do this with a really neat collaboration with Arnaud Delorme, who's at IONS. He developed a program where we could test psi abilities online, and we could do that pre and post their meditation course, and looking at that data. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. That is really one of my deep interests, is looking at these extraordinary abilities that are generated by various forms or kinds of meditative practices. So as I said, I've done a lot of work in teaching meditative strategies to patients, to students, in studies, looking at the effect on their physiology, their stress level, their anxiety, those sorts of things. And what I noticed over time is people spontaneously reporting, even early in my career, 20 years ago, people whom I had taught meditation to started reporting things like an increased tuition, or telepathic sort of knowledge. And they felt safe enough with me, I think, because they knew, that I'm the one who's teaching them these weird things. But they felt safe enough to disclose this. And I really wanted to look into this further, not just the spontaneous reports from my patients or students, but also looking at this in a scientific way. What other abilities are there out there that we can help create that might be happening spontaneously also, and can we use this for good in our world, not only to help individuals in really robust ways, but to help our world. So some of these extraordinary abilities that I am interested in are listed here, and I'm not going to read all of them, but I've been able to start pursuing some investigation of some of these. And some of the early research that I found by folks out at IONS and other places made me very excited, because I saw there seemed to be this significant relationship between the amount of meditation and psi performance, with a positive correlation there. So maybe there was something to this, Although I have to say, and I'll be interested in what all of you have to share, but I've noticed that to me, some of these folks, it seems to be almost like a light bulb comes on, and they have this wonderful transformation fairly quickly, but that doesn't happen too often. I am going to share real quick information that you might already know. Cassie Veaton, who is my colleague at IONS, did this original research of a survey research with many other collaborators, looking at just basically a survey of what people experience when they meditate. And you can see here very high numbers of people reporting these sort of mystical or transcendent experiences, and higher than you might expect. I mean, at least for me, that was pretty high. And looking at extraordinary experiences and abilities as well, again, fairly high across this group of people who were meditating. Now, you can say, well, this was, and people did say, well, this is a group of California meditators, so, of course. So they did a follow-up study that looked at engineers and scientists, people you would think maybe California meditators. And what you saw, if they compared this, what they called those meditators, they're still quite similar in some of these areas, reporting at least one experience of these extraordinary type. And as you see, not completely similar on all realms. Most of the enthusiasts and report much more, but these are not zeros, which is pretty interesting to me. So even the scientists and engineers reporting the rate. And we did this study, as I said, collaborating, looking at 118 meditators who were novel meditators, so they were naive to it before they were doing this. They self-selected into a meditation group. So this was not randomized, unfortunately. But we looked at pre and post assessments, and again, teaching them a mindfulness of their choice. This was one of the things a meditation strategies of their choice, but it was rigorous and had to be 2 weeks. And then we looked at these assessments of not just things like mindfulness and connectedness and anxiety, but also mystical or transcendent experiences or paranormal psychic experience. And what we found was that the people going into meditation who self-selected were more mindful and had a higher belief in psi and more psi experience from the beginning, although it did significantly increase to the post test. But they were different from the beginning, so that was pretty limiting for us. We tasks online, and we did not see any differences, but we suspect that that's partly due to the limitations of the study. What we did see, though, is that for the people meditating, like I said, there were still changes over time, even from their baseline. And they seem to have a significantly higher level of meaning attached to it than the people who were not meditating, which was interesting to me. So we concluded from that study that we needed to do a more rigorous study. And that is what we have coming up next to help us look at the differences between groups that are more similar at the beginning. All Foundation out of Portugal, we're going to be randomizing people who are novel to meditation to either a much more structured, everyone's going to receive the same. It's from Richie Davidson out in Wisconsin, his standardized introduction to attention and connection, those modules of meditation, and that will be compared to a controlled, standardized, healthy exercise and fitness program. So we hope with that study to look more carefully at the differences and what happens. Again, with the same sort of outcomes. We're also going to be focused on this idea of social connectedness and oneness and the power of that on psychic abilities. And so we will be using the random number generator again to see if we can impact that, as well as measure other reported abilities. One of the findings that we've consistently found, and fairly consistently, and seems to be out in the literature as well, is that unlike what you might assume about the brain function in people meditating, at least with specific certain meditations, you don't see a lot of activity and firing. You actually see a quieting. And I think this is really interesting, and I would also I'd love to have a discussion about this. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I don't claim to be one. I think, though, intuitively, this makes so much sense to me that yes, it would be our physiology sort of getting out of the way so that we could access this. And I think that fits with a lot of the traditions where these meditations come from that we've secularized. So I hope to have a discussion about that, and we're hopeful in our ongoing neuro imaging studies to sort of look at this across a lot of different areas of people with these abilities. All right. Finally, I am also have an appointment in our cancer center and work a lot with the palliative care patients, the patients who are actively dying, and those who have fear of death and dying. So some of my students wanted to look at this and see, what are we dealing with here? They helped me in the clinic, and we're very interested in doing some more analysis of the literature. So we've begun looking at this, and our rates we discovered in a study we just did and we got to publish. We found that we had about 30% of our patients with a fear of death and dying that's at a level of a good deal, very much, or tremendous. And this seems to sort of fit with some of the numbers you see from other surveys where you'll see here 2017, a Chapman University survey showed 20.3%, and then a 2020, this was Statista, this is 11% very afraid and 31% somewhat afraid. And the reason we find this interesting is because if you can find a way to work with folks to help them with this, it would be very, very helpful for their quality of life, for their families, for the healthcare workers who work with them. So we examined some of the literature on people's acceptability of treatment for this. As I mentioned earlier, Terra management theory seems to be the main one in psychology, which is, either there's two basic ways to approach it. Fear of death is denial, which only works for so long, and then some way of accommodating this into your worldview. Often it's through a religious conceptualization, and we are looking at that sort of spiritual piece of it. So really, for me, it's interesting to say, okay, how do we fit these pieces of information that we gather from these different areas in the flower pot into a larger theoretical understanding? And even more importantly, how can we use this knowledge for good? It's very, very much like, in my mind, very much like artificial intelligence. It's all quite exciting, and you want to just keep finding out things and studying things and generating data, and yet we have to be careful. We have to have a moral and ethical sort of groundwork that undergirds this, because as someone pointed out over the weekend at the SMN, people are using meditation strategies in the military to help soldiers carry out atrocities and stay calm, which is just horrifying. And so we need that underpinning as well of what are the moral obligations of this research. And it does not escape my attention, and that in many of the spiritual traditions, pursuit of these cities is not encouraged. It is actually actively discouraged, because they didn't want people to only be pursuing this for this narcissistic type of reason. That I want to be able to read your mind, or I want to be able to know the future. So we have to keep that in mind. There were very wise people who developed, and that shouldn't diminish, though, our excitement at looking at what an expanded consciousness. The experience, I believe it was in India, where there were thousands upon thousands of people meditating all at the same time, and the impact that had. So that expanded consciousness worldwide, what would that look like, and how do we build towards that? And personally, as a clinician working in a big medical center, I truly wonder what would it look like if we did not have this sort of pathologic fear of death that exacerbated some of the, dragging out people's lives with poor quality of life and that sort of thing. Or what if we understood that we're all connected? What if we understood that the way I conduct myself does have an impact on you, and vice versa? So these questions are very inspiring to me. Decades of lifetimes of work to do in this area, and I'm thrilled about it. So some of our immediate next steps we're taking is really broadening the field of meditation research. So looking at these transcendent experiences, these even physical phenomena. I just have so many ideas for experiments in my head. I just don't have enough hours in the day to do them all. So we need these prospective randomized studies if we're going to keep it in that scientific realm where my colleagues in the School of Medicine will understand it. Someone asked me this, it almost always comes up, these abilities exist. We know that. Why do we have to keep studying it and doing these trials? And part of it is because whether we like it or not, the prevailing scientific approach is that we have these sort of things, this data, and presented in that way. And for some of the people that we need to influence, this may be, at least in my humble opinion, one of the few ways we might be able to sort of get them on board. And I think we need to use more and more the technology that we have to, not just in providing access to instruction, but ways that I probably haven't even thought of, and that maybe 2 generations from now we'll think of. But how can we expand the knowledge about this, collect this information from cultures that we have not necessarily heard from? And I know there are people out there doing that. I would love to hear more from them. And again, for me, this idea of communication and all of us sort of coming together to collaborate and build this expanded consciousness, and with the security of knowing we've got people looking at the ethics and the morality of it, as well as the theoretical meaning behind it, really is the realm of work, that next realm, whatever that might be. So I get very excited about this work, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time to hear from you. And so I thank you for your attention. I know I've been talking a long time, and I look forward to this next segment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. Very, very interesting. Dai, welcome from Canada. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Wow, what a wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. I'd just like really to add to Bernard's point, excuse me, among your controls, have you considered having control groups who are taking up a sport or exercise or listening to music or playing a musical instrument for the same length of time that you're meditating, or even doing puzzles or whatnot, to distinguish to what extent meditation is different from absorption in any activity. I mean, the word meditation is used extremely loosely. I use it as a hypnotherapist. I'm producing recordings and so on. Are they meditations? I don't know. But they do absorb attention. And would these other phenomena be linked in any way to other forms of absorption, if I can call it that?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, so that's exactly the line of thinking that we were following. So that is reassuring to know that's what you would suggest as well, because as I said, this upcoming study will have a control that is more of that based on health and learning a physical activity. And in the study we designed to follow for the lupus study, the patients with lupus, that first study was a single arm study just to look at the acceptability and to design the intervention. And we developed a 2-armed study that had exactly what you're talking about, a control condition that involved almost precisely what you described. So sort of this absorption factor where they were doing artwork while listening to music. So they're interpreting the music and designing art, and then they had some physical movement, but it was more based on functional, like, you know, how to lift a box properly and things like that. And so where we thought, can we do something quite comparable and assess what is the difference there? So that study has not yet been funded, so we haven't implemented that yet, but this is wonderful that we are thinking alike on that. Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Di. And whilst we wait for somebody else wanting to ask a question, I would like to ask you, Kim, whether you've had any spiritual, paranormal, call it what you will, experiences personally.
Well, my cuckoo clock is answering for you. Well, thank you for that question. As I said, I grew up reading a lot about these things just on my own. For some reason, I was quite a little weird as a kid, I think. Not too many people that I knew. I grew up in West Virginia in the mountains, and I had that kind of childhood where you were barefoot outside and climbing in trees and riding horses bareback and things like that. Early on, I would do things that were natural to me. What I look back on now and understand was scrying. I would go out, we had big things that collected water, and I would put a burlap sack underneath and hold it up and look in the water, and I could see things. And I just did this naturally and on my own, and told my mother about it. And I really credit her, she was quite open, and I think she was probably Wiccan, but didn't know it, didn't call it that. We all knew the changes of the seasons. We all understood nature. We lived very close to nature. And I remember holding this duality in my head very early on. As a young child, for instance, I asked my father and my mother both. I had this idea. I was trying to figure out life and the world and everything. And I went to my father and I asked him, what is the purpose of life?
Mm-hmm.
Easy question, right? You know. He said, oh, that is easy. He was a surgeon. So he said, the purpose of life is to reproduce. That's what we're programmed to do as living organisms. I was like, oh, okay, good. Then I went to my mother and I asked the same question, what is the purpose of life? And she said, oh, that is easy. It's love. And so early on, I took this. I mean, I literally was probably 6 or 7 years old, and I said, oh, okay, it's both. All right. So I combined those. And then as I progressed, I had experiences, for instance, in my teens or 20s, going to the beach. We would go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which is on the coast, and there's an ocean. I was with my mother, and I shared this in a little piece with David Lorimer before the SMN conference, so some of you might have heard it, but we were there in the sun, and it was just her and I, and there were other people on the ocean. I had fallen asleep. I had a towel over my face, and I heard a little bit of a commotion that sort of woke me up. And so I got up onto sort of my elbows and glanced and looked and saw a big crowd at the water's edge, and didn't think much of it, but then decided to sit up and look a little bit more, and saw that it was my mother, and she was sort of being carried out of the ocean by a lifeguard on one side, and this older gentleman on the other side. And so I thought, well, okay, she's okay. And I just, for whatever reason, I stayed where I was. She walked up, she ended up departing from the two of them, coming and lying down. And I started to get up, and she said, no, lay down. I'm fine. And we both just laid down. I closed my eyes, and I just said to her, who was that man, the older man? And she said, That was my grandfather. Oh, and I still get shivers when I tell that story. We both saw it. She had a difficult childhood, had been effectively raised by her grandparents, and was very close to her. And she really didn't talk. I didn't talk much about it. I just remember at that, just accepting that. Of course, that was your grandfather. He would, of course, come to save you. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, I realize I've incorporated this into my life as a natural part of being human. Yeah. And so when I experience these things, I think I just accept it as part of reality. And my hope is that openness translates to the people I interact with and the patients I work with. And that might be part of why they can share with me these experiences that they often haven't shared with anyone, and certainly not their other doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is very interesting, because I wonder whether I grew up in a place in which this kind of thing is also seen as, or understood or experienced as, quite normal, at least in my environment. But you grew up in the United States. I mean, how did you interact, and how were your experiences and your kind of worldview, I suppose, because that informed your worldview? How did you interact with the rest of your friends and society and culture that you were participating in?
I mean, I think I interacted quite normally. I had a very normal childhood, a very nice childhood.
And could you talk about these things?
Sorry?
Could you talk about these things with the friends?
Certainly with my family, we certainly did. With certain friends, yes. I mean, I was also intelligent enough to understand that some people would be more open to this than others. And, had that sort of knowledge of who I can share this with and who probably won't be as accepting about it. Mm-hmm. And, and I think it's actually more common than we might think in even these westernized places like the United States. We haven't always talked about it, but when I bring it up, almost any time there's a gathering of people and we're talking and sharing, this was before COVID, people will endorse these if they feel open and I've heard of so many of my friends with after-death communications, with these spontaneous experiences, none of them hearing dead chickens, granted. That's special. That's very special, Sue. But people do report these things if they have a safe place to do it.
Exactly, if they feel safe. Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed, Kim. It was very, very interesting, and as you can tell, it really kind of was inspirational for, I think, everybody. Certainly for me, it was. Thanks everybody for participating this evening. Thanks again.